Hey everyone, this is Soph, and you're listening to the Beyond Pain and Fatigue podcast, where we explore the complexity of chronic pain, fatigue, and invisible illness. Awareness of neurodiversity, including ADHD and autism, is growing, and increasingly we're seeing a link between neurodivergence and pain, fatigue, and other invisible illnesses. In this episode, Ollie and I chat with Dr Oli Meredith, an ADHD public health academic, to gain insight into their research focused on experiences of ADHD and autistic women and gender diverse folk. We also look at the bigger picture with a discussion about the importance of recognising bias and inequities that influence research and healthcare. It is my very special pleasure to introduce Dr. Oli Meredith today, who's an autistic and ADHD non-binary public health academic based out of Canberra. Oli's interdisciplinary research spans neurodiversity, chronic conditions, gender, sleep, complementary and alternative medicine, and physical activity. Her work is deeply informed by her lived experiences with ADHD and autism, which she leverages to amplify the voices of neurodivergent and marginalised communities.
Oli's route into academia is long and circuitous, but was born from her frustration in the lack of understanding and support she found whilst navigating chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia whilst living and working in Cambodia. In her project, Hiding or Thriving, the lived experiences and coping strategies of women and gender diverse people with ADHD, Oli leads a cross-institutional and neurodivergent team investigating the self-directed strategies and healthcare barriers faced by women and gender diverse individuals with ADHD. This research includes the investigation of co-occurring chronic conditions and pain many neurodivergent women face, often alone. Oli believes, like we do, in the power of sharing stories for healing. Thank you so much for joining us today.
No, it's a pleasure. Yeah, it's really a privilege to talk to you both.
So I'm fascinated to hear about the where this started for you, this journey in Cambodia, maybe, if that's where it began, or was there something before that?
I think there's always a lot before it, but there's a point that it all comes to the surface in such a big way that you need to change your direction. When I was in Cambodia, I'd had the usual glandular fever. I had dengue fever, less common for someone from Australia at least, and I just couldn't get better. And so then I didn't know at this stage that it was chronic fatigue syndrome, but I was just really unwell for a long time. And there were no answers in Cambodia. And then I did move to Australia. I'm actually from Britain originally. I said Australia, but I moved to Australia with my partner and started to find some more answers, and eventually got this label of chronic fatigue syndrome. And at least it was a name. So I'm really interested about the naming of things. And even if that thing might not be completely accurate and say it all, it can just be really helpful to hold a space for you to be able to acknowledge what's been going on for you. So that was helpful to a degree. But I was very frustrated. I actually became a yoga teacher during all this. I was doing strategic things, working in an NGO in Cambodia, peace and conflict transformation. But it was part of my healing journey. Because there weren't answers. There was no medical professionals who were able to help me. But often people would be very kind about it. They'd say, look, we haven't got anything to do to help you, but perhaps you could try this. And that was actually a helpful thing. So then I just realized it wasn't enough, though, there was no peer reviewed, or I didn't know the word peer review at that stage, but there was no real research and really being able to help me and sort of validate what was going on or give me answers for the future. And I realized that was something that affected women as well. Like often I was wondering at that time. And Ollie, it's really interesting to speak to you as a fellow as well, but at the time I was wondering, this is really affecting women in a big way. Is that why we're not knowing more about it? And I don't really know if that is the whole case now. So anyway, it led me eventually to go, do you know what? I just need to get into academia. I need to become the academic. I need to be doing that. So, despite my background in being in the arts, my master's and my undergrad degrees, history, philosophy, politics, I embarked on a PhD in public health. I hate statistics, but I just thought, no, I've just got to suck it up, and I've just got to get myself in that space. I need to have a voice at the table.
It's inspiring.
It's funny. I can almost see Ollie Crossley. We're gonna need code names, I think. Like we need like OC. There you go, OC. I can see it like sitting there almost like vibrating with excitement when you mentioned yoga, because that's very much a space that he does a lot of work in as well. And I'm sure
Ollie.
There is so much. You guys are, I think there's going to be some really great conversation that comes out from this. I guess it's funny that you say that you're from your original undergrad background in the arts and history and almost that sort of social space, because I actually would argue increasingly that's sort of the direction that a lot of health research is also going. So, I think that brings so much value to the work that you're doing, even if it does feel maybe more indirect of a way in. You've spoken a bit about your lived experience and I guess your journey from a chronic fatigue space and knowing the research that you're doing now as well. I'm interested in how your own lived experience of neurodivergence has sort of shaped your work as a researcher as well. Like, do you have any insights into how you feel that has sort of framed the work that you're doing or maybe influenced where you've ended up?
Yeah, in so many ways, and now in such a prominent way. But it's been a gradual thing. And as I said, that I went in originally thinking I'd help people with chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, invisible illnesses, especially women. That was my thought at that stage, and that has shifted a lot now too. But yeah, I didn't know about ADHD and neurodiversity, so even the experience of doing a PhD was damn difficult. In some points, and I don't know if you've had this experience, guys, where sometimes like it's easy, like the hard stuff is the easy stuff, isn't it? Well, at least it was for me, because again, if you're hyper focused on something, like like the deep discussion, the analytical thinking, for me wasn't my challenge. We've all got different ones, but for me, that wasn't the hard part. It was, understanding how to fit things into a PowerPoint to get through your confirmation of candidature. That was a real one for me. Just sometimes just a blank page, just the admin process of getting in things, or normally administrative things, but often things that other people would find simple.
Yeah.
Not all people. So that was really interesting. The actual experience of this place I wanted to get to was all about getting to this place where I could help. And through that process, at some point, I started to twig about ADHD. And then I think I listened to Hannah Gadsby speaking, actually. And autism is so much resonated. And I just, I cried like people do at the whole festival, just a recognition that there was. It's so funny, isn't it, how when that happens, things that you already know about yourself, but they're hidden, they're suppressed, so there's no upper language up here where you can actually acknowledge them, and how suddenly you're allowed to be all the things that you know you are, but you've been denying, because you're so desperate to avoid words like lazy or incompetent or letting people down. So anyway, that all came to the surface, and just it was sort of as I was just getting into academia after that, the whole language around everything changed, because I realized that actually ADHD was the way into the same conversation I wanted to have. It was ADHD and neurodiversity. And so I shifted there. And I started to tell people at work once I had been diagnosed. And then the more I did that, the more people were listening. And I realized I love the discussion about neurodiversity, not just neurodivergence, as two separate things, but realizing how that is a portal almost to everything, just about compassion and acknowledgement of different ways of being, knowing, understanding the world. And like, what more beautiful thing is there as humans to develop languages for that, to understand difference? I know that sounds really cliche, but as an educator, that's become a really integral part of not only my research, but now my teaching. I teach with a pedagogy of compassionate pedagogy. There's emerging academic literature of that pedagogy and its usefulness in education specifically, and neurodiversity. Neurodivergence. Neurodivergence and education. So it's informed everything. So now I share that with colleagues. Sophie, I know you've helped with that as well a little bit. I asked for your input on some lecture I've given on that area. And I just find the more you open up, it's just that authentic dialogue. That's, again, when I say it's a portal to everything, I feel like in this day and age, where that's become a bit of an issue, lack of authenticity, people not working in jobs they're really enjoying necessarily, or there's external motivation versus intrinsic motivation. Like, it's a key time to actually be releasing people and opening up a more authentic language for everyone, like wherever you land and whatever your quirks are. So yeah, I've really made a commitment now to say I'm going to be me in whatever I'm doing as much as I can. Like, that's an ongoing commitment, like, there's growth in that, in terms of being a researcher and an academic. So presentations I give in future, I'll let myself do it my way, which isn't always beautiful. Often it will minimize how many slides I use, because that's something I really struggle with, but in a way that centers like my authenticity. And the more you do that, the more you realize that that's actually what people's ears are perk up for, actually, isn't it? Yeah.
Totally. There's so many threads that excite me in what you've just said there, but I think particularly that what you said before in learning that there's a label or an understanding for this that can let you be a more authentic self. What particularly strikes you that's different now? I know we want to learn more about your research, but just in teaching or in any aspect of your life, that how that authenticity has changed people's experience of learning in your work.
Gosh, I guess we've all had a teacher who's seen us, right? And what difference it makes. Like, you let go of all the defensiveness and the stuff you're battling, and the energy you've got left over, which I think is really intrinsically connected with CFS too. The extra energy that dims and sims, which I'm sure you guys have talked about at some stage, that when you've got positive stuff flowing around, then your potential flows, right? And so it's not only just being that good teacher. I think there's philosophies and pedagogy that whoever you are, whatever your naturalness at like creating nurturing environments, if you saw, it's almost like developing a protocol for compassion. Like it doesn't have to just flow naturally. There's just things you can do that start to open up those spaces where people can start to feel safe. So a lot of it is to do around safety. Again, that's going to be paralleling lots of themes I'm sure you guys touch on.
Big time.
Feeling safe, feeling accepted. So again, that starts with me. So when you say how does this affect my practice, I always say I'm ADHD at the beginning when I talk, and I always hope that opens up communication from people in a nice way, and it does, or it tends to, and maybe not everyone, but people will explain what's really going on for them rather than the dog ate my homework. And I know that no one really says they're university, but you know what I mean. And then you can encourage that conversation when I can say, no, you can't have an extension, and we can stop there. But it's unlikely. It's unlikely when someone shares what's really going on for them. And I've been helping educate other lecturers on that too, because I think there's such an idea of I hear this a lot. When I was at university, I used to just bunker down. I didn't ask for extensions. I didn't ask for this and that. And there's such privilege that comes with that, because I think, well, first, 30 years ago, there were so many fewer women doing it. Most people were not having jobs at the same time. And people with chronic conditions just didn't stand a chance. And a lot of neurodivergent people didn't stand a chance. And we know from the research that a lot of neurodivergent people will have dropped out. And how many, and this might be familiar to you guys too, have like started and stopped, different degrees and all that stuff. Like, well, you might be talking about having got through that, but these are students that didn't survive in that day and age. And are you saying that they shouldn't survive in this day and age?
Totally. Apologies. I'll be selfish to ask another question, but this is a real fascinating one for me and for perhaps Soph as well, with the lived experience of also, being neurodivergent and ADHD, is that very label itself, as I've understood in just the last 12 months, that you couldn't have the two diagnoses 10 years ago. And all the gender bias and everything that comes along with it. So for the listener and for the benefit of me as well, I wonder if you could explain a little bit about what that diagnosis entails, what that label from different perspectives of disability entails for anyone, but maybe also for you specifically, if you're happy to share.
Yeah, and I'll just acknowledge I'm on the journey still with that. And I think we all are as academics too, like ADHD, that as something that stands alone. It's a really new idea that we can actually be different as not just the mixture of two things, but one thing, ADHD. And I would appreciate and listen to anyone who comes from any angle at that, people who disagree with that too. Like it should be this ongoing, and there doesn't have to be one place you arrive at with that. But I think it's been helpful for me because, and I've spoken to a lot of people in my research and friends who really denying things themselves, gaslighting themselves, because they say, well, I can't be ADHD because of this, and I can't be autistic because of that. I'm okay with eye contact. I love parties, but I also really need alone time. I'm someone like that. You can probably seem quite gregarious, but this part of me is really introverted, and there's lots of stimuli that just, can kill me. Almost, like, not literally. That's the way I've perceived it, but I think a lot of other people look at it differently. But for me, it explains extremities, which I've almost, and I don't want to say this in a way that means I think I have bipolar. Absolutely not. And people have bipolar. That is not me. But almost, I've been asking questions like that, like how can I be so much of this at sometimes and so much of that at others? And again, like it's just taken the energy out of that for me, is I'm able to pop it out there and go, well, probably that's explained just by who I am. And that's okay. I don't know if I love this analogy that I've made myself, but it makes sense to me that in Greek literature and Roman literature, they will talk about this, and actually First Nations stories. There's always so many stories about the power of a name and how some archetype or some goddess won't share their name. Because if you know the name, you take the power. But I feel conversely, if you know the name, then you've got the power.
What you're saying there around feeling like there are these constant extremes that are almost at war with each other. I think certainly even like reflecting on my own experience of that, I think for me, my ADHD symptoms was sort of the start of my journey, and that was my entry point, so to speak. And I didn't realize part of what meant that it took so long for me to be diagnosed was because the different aspects of the two of autism and ADHD were almost like masking each other, because I didn't fit neatly in one of the two categories. And so I was kind of ending up in this weird, chaotic
Yes.
absolutely not functional, but it sort of was like, I guess it was such a dynamic, different experience that it made it really hard to classify. And it was only really when I started medication for my ADHD that I was like, oh, okay, there's a whole host of stuff that I'd not really become as cognizant or aware of that became way more apparent when my ADHD symptoms were controlled. And I've heard that a lot of different people, there's a lot of discussion now around the concept of masking. I would take a guess that probably a lot of the people who are listening to this have come across the idea of masking before, but would you be comfortable maybe explaining the idea of masking to someone who might not have heard of that term before?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I'll acknowledge that there's a portal to everything. This is something that I think everyone does in some element of their life. And through the research I've done, I've discovered that more and more. But particularly with neurodivergence, it's a concept where, and often diagnosis gets missed because people are masking. So they're wearing a mask that might be emulating behaviors that they seem deemed to be acceptable and suppressing their natural reactions to things, perhaps. And so that masking is an external mask, but it happens at such a young age generally to be deemed fit for society that people are actually unconscious about their mask. So that's again another reason why diagnosis can be really helpful. A label isn't everything, but it can mean that someone even realizes, oh my God, that's not actually. I discovered that with autism because I am quite social and eye contact doesn't seem to be a big deal. And it took me a while to discover that I've been forcing eye contact for a long, long, long time. And it's not to say I hate eye contact. I'm so used to it now. It's not to say I hate it, but I just all the time, and you guys are nodding emphatically. I mean, it would be something that it's not that I hate it. It's just that it takes heaps of energy, and I'd be so busy going, "Am I still looking? Am I still looking?" I'm not hearing anything that's anything that's going in. And so these are the things that are taking the energy. These are the things that are keeping this mask on. If you could just look away, I could listen to what you're saying, like I'm doing now, and I can actually just connect with what you're saying a little bit more. So that's an example of a facet of masking, might be the eye contact.
I resonate with that too. That was first suggested that I could be autistic. I was like, no, what do you mean? I look at people all the time. And it was a while until I realized that like most people don't have this running like meta commentary in their head during a conversation where it's like, has it been more than 10 seconds since you've looked at someone in the face? Are you crossing your arms? Is your body posture giving off signals? How is everyone else behaving? Are you mirroring tone? And so much of it, like you said, it was always there, but I kind of hadn't realized the extent of it and the fact that that's not necessarily most people's experiences.
Exactly.
How tiring it was. So one of the things that I've noticed in my experiences, even going out to start my own practice and having Ollie come on board with me, I have found so much of a difference in being able to work with Ollie, who is also ADHD, to not have to have, because we're both kind of on the same wavelength and can communicate in a more natural way, I guess, because we're less worried about, how are we coming across to people who might be more neurotypical. So yeah, it's been interesting to have that contrast as well and how much less taxing and less energy demanding it is to be working with people in that space.
And I think just from that, I wanted to add the masking thing. And again, with my research, it's been nice to reflect on the power of a mask as well and the right to wear a mask. And I think part of the diagnosis helps you know what your mask is and when it's tripping you up. And it's just, is it a choice? So at least have a choice of a mask, because there are times you don't feel safe and maybe you need to speak a language. And sometimes it's just language speaking. It's like, this is your language, this is mine. I'll choose to speak yours. And I realized through my own unmasking and this eye contact stuff, I realized I've been teaching especially one of my children, and both of them really, to mask. And we all do it. We teach the kids to mask, to, say, you almost force them, for example. Sophie, I think you've got a good language around this. I can't remember. I think you've got a great phrase for this, where we sort of force kids to almost force them to come up with a sickness for not going to school, when in fact they're just overwhelmed. But overwhelmed isn't a word they're allowed to use, But if you as a parent can start to at least allow them to unmask around you. So I really encourage that with the kids. Like, just tell me you don't need to have a tummy ache. Just tell me what's going on. You're overwhelmed. And maybe they don't say to school exactly the way you would say. Like, you can allow them that maybe. But for me, that's become really important to notice I'm not forcing the kids to mask unconsciously. So, for example, I've got one kid who finds eye contact really hard, and we're always saying eye contact. Eye contact is so boring hearing that now, that I used to say all the time. And I realized even with my dad, that my dad would look at me and we'd be in a social situation. I'd feel a bit embarrassed that, I'm a kid and he's looking at me and he's supposed to be speaking to this adult, and I would just like go like this, trying to deliver his eyes over to where I knew they were meant to go socially. And now I feel really bad for my dad, like, because I was embarrassed by him that he didn't make eye contact with the person he was meant to. So all this kind of training that I've been involved of for other people to uphold their masks is kind of, yeah, interesting.
You mentioned this idea of safety, and I think that that's so important when you're having these conversations, because the reality of it is that there are a lot of situations and a lot of contexts in which it isn't safe to unmask. And I think it actually leads into a really interesting discussion around particular groups, particularly if we're talking about, say, First Nations or LGBTQI groups or other people who might belong to, I guess, groups that might experience a greater degree of adversity or challenges or stigma when they're trying to seek care or help. In your research, or even just in your, I guess, your learning throughout the process of doing your research, have you got any insights as to, I guess, some of the challenges around some of these considerations, and I guess maybe the intersectional sort of lens that we need to take?
Yeah, again, theme of neurodivergence being a portal to everything. I think this is just such an important theme about intersectionality, and it's great because lots of neurodivergent people are, got great empathy, and they're open to understanding different people because they've had these experiences. And it's a great entry point for us to remember, all of us to remember, that everyone's got so many different layers. I interviewed a lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds, but just as an example, one gender diverse person said, "I'm a Black person who's had to mask as a Black person my entire life. I mask my autism and my ADHD because it's just a flow-on effect from my skin, what we call code switching. As a Black person, to be safe in a white supremacist world, Black people code switch in every context, until we come home where we can be our own self." And other people talked about being a disabled person, maybe a wheelchair user, so many different ways that they operated in the world that perhaps other people might not understand. Yeah, there were so many elements that other people might not understand, but what really affected not only their life and their life experience, but the process of diagnosis. So again, a lot of, middle class white people will find diagnosis a really challenging space already. So then add these other layers. It's really complex. I spoke to a First Nations person who misdiagnosis as well, because she had ADHD and it was spotted from a really young age. And she said she was that girl who would sort of jump off the walls, the girl rather than the boy. And being in an Indigenous background, this was 60 years ago, it was so unacceptable for her family. It was really difficult because her parents would be ashamed, or not ashamed, but just really scared of what that would mean in terms of being taken away. Because if that was been a white boy, the dangers would be a lot less. But as an Indigenous kid, an Indigenous girl, like, you need to be quiet, you need to keep your head down. That was, I'm paraphrasing, but that was her sort of language. Sorry, I should acknowledge, obviously, as a white person, I'm very privileged from background from Britain. I can talk about all these layers of disadvantage, but you can also get a bit absorbed in that, forgetting your privilege as well.
Absolutely. I've, often reflected as a white woman, obviously there's been a lot of discussion that probably a lot of people who are listening have heard about, the gender bias when it comes to diagnosis, and how the experiences of women and non-binary people are often not well reflected in diagnostic criteria. Reflecting on then even my own experience of diagnosis and I guess maybe actively unmasking more as I've gone through that journey, there is so much privilege in being able to do that, because yes, while I might face potentially more resistance or risk of negative interactions compared to a white man, because, we know that often the gender discrimination and the way that women are perceived when they might be potentially, say, more blunt or direct. There's those layers of it too, but that is a totally different situation to, say, a Black woman or a First Nations woman, where there's that added layer of how they might be perceived as being aggressive or threatening. Like there is just so many layers and levels to it. And yeah, I agree. It's important that we actually have that lens and we take it into our research, because I think we've got a really long history of research that has been very, very narrow in the experiences it's captured. So thank you for sharing that. It's really sobering to hear some of these experiences, but I think so important that they are told.
Yeah, and so I've got the project that I think you guys mentioned in my bio, the Hiding or Thriving project, where I interviewed women and gender diverse people. When I did the recruitment, I was really conscious, and I only interviewed 21. I'll tell you more about the future research that will go out in a broader way, because I really want to understand their experiences in a bit of a deeper way. than the conversations that have been had in academia so far. And I really want to encourage a diversity, which is hard in qualitative research because it's never going to be representative. But I consciously put out an advert with people, very mixed backgrounds, picture. And it's funny that my fellow researchers just didn't think to do that kind of thing. And actually 2 of the Black women who applied actually specifically said that post drew them in. So I think it's that thing about being an ally again, is that it's not about just being okay with something. It's about making active steps to address the equity issues or lack of equity.
Yeah. Active anti-racist, anti-oppressive practices in all realms.
You have to have their voices, don't you, in order to know how to do that? Because I can't just be anti-racist. Like I don't know when I'm being, I've got that bias that's making me act in ways that are oppressive as well. And one of the ways, again, I'd love to amplify these voices. That's why I do the research. One of the most beautiful points and that really stirred me and also made me go, was a Black woman again, who said, which will be relevant in this podcast, about spoons. And because I'm sure most people listening will have a language of spoons and how many spoons you spend. I don't know if I need to explain that. Let me know if you do. To sort of make sure that's clear. How much energy you have. Said most Black women especially, but Black people don't have spoons to begin with. So the assumption going into that debate, I just, it was just wonderful to hear, because it was really good for me because I had used that so often, this idea of spoons. And also I think the idea that we can even compare who's got how many spoons, because I think at the center of this and the beauty of the discussion around neurodivergence is actually having permission for all of us to ask, and space to ask, what do I need? Like not I've got cancer, so therefore I want this, I need this treatment, or I've got this great diagnosis and now I should get some attention, or that kind of thing. It's like, it's not the school kid who's like now got a burning fever, so they're allowed to stay home. Like, it's like, what do you actually need? And it's a really difficult thing in society, right? Like, to be able to ask that question. But I think it causes so much sickness and illness if we don't. Like, it's short-term gain, pumping people for their productivity versus a long-term gain of a peaceful society and a cohesive one, a well society.
Yeah, 100%. That's actually really interesting. Ollie, OC, we've got to come up with better nicknames. I wonder, maybe just in case there is someone who doesn't know spoons, would you be happy to give a quick explanation?
Yeah, this is my pet favorite topic, and it's something I'm really keen to ask you about, Ollie. Dr. Oli, that sounds cool. Just that idea of an energy budget, and hearing that story from that participant, Dr. Oli, around that there weren't spoons to begin with for that person, and for many people, that it's almost like the same idea of using an energy budget metaphor that comes with, this is my brain going, well, 3 thoughts at once. I'll come back and explain it a bit, but the idea of being in a deficit. So with that and your research and your own personal journey, there was I think a quote that summarizes this that I listened to in your talk for the ADHD conference. I'm not sure if you shared it with one of your children. You can't do something that your body doesn't want you to do. And it landed on me, and I went, that's what being neurodivergent has finally given me, much more power and permission to figure out what it's actually telling me. Like, how have you found in your participants and yourself that I don't know, the listening process, maybe we could call it?
Oh, it's so true, Ollie. And I think that's how I've gone from chronic fatigue syndrome to realizing that ADHD or neurodivergence was actually the entry point. Because chronic fatigue syndrome came after, because it was a build-up of overriding maybe the amygdala, I don't know, which is perhaps be part of an explanation for why often, and not always, of course, but there's a correlation with trauma for some people, that overriding your body's needs and your wants. And sometimes that's society not giving you the power, like a kid who has to go to school despite what their body's telling them, or have been forced to do something when they need rest. And that can happen to a whole group of people, which is so fascinating, isn't it? Because of the way we set up society, which could be women, of course, in terms of, well, when you get home, you've then got to do the housework. And these are all cliches, I know, and I know that's not the case for a lot of people, but you'll do the housework, look after the kids on top. So it could be all these issues that actually eventually lead to something like, you guys might have a different view on that, but eventually may lead to something. That was certainly my experience to chronic fatigue syndrome. I think it was a lifetime of overriding or not being able to advocate and say that's no good for me. That was certainly the context I was in. That's at that time when I got chronic fatigue syndrome, and then fibromyalgia. Fibromyalgia came really badly a bit later. But again, when I was just pushing in a way that my body actually had to say, if you're not going to stop, I'm going to have to stop you. And I think what was interesting is some of the things that come off neurodivergence, some of these things that we're not sure how they're connected, but like pathological demand avoidance. And I know that's a term that's not very, that's a term that might be helpful, but sometimes perhaps we need to have another name for. But again, I spoke to a couple of Black people who said that was a cultural thing, because it's like you have made us slaves. So I'm born with pathological demand avoidance from especially white people. It's like, are you asking another thing of me when you have taken, everything you've taken, what my family had, maybe stolen children, like you've taken my mother or you've taken my children, like now you're going to be asking me to go and, take this vaccine or do X, Y, Z. It's not something that's a stubbornness. It's like something that I inherited, which, we can go off on lots of tangents about intergenerational trauma and the actual epigenetics of that, which I find really fascinating as well. But yes, that's a good starting point.
And it's such an important point, isn't it? Because I think that really highlights, a lot of the, I guess, more of the critical conversations I've seen happening around mental health and even the diagnostic process, even beyond just autism and ADHD, but at a broad sense, like what we determine as pathological and disordered is actually based on socially constructed norms. And so
yeah,
that frame is so important, because it's like, well, who's actually defining what's seen as pathological? And a lot of the time it's who's in power. And typically these are generally, historically, particularly if we're looking at mental health, white men. The DSM, has been defined by that, and that privilege and power and those, I guess, limited benefits bleed through. And so, of course I could imagine, not that I think it's right, but I could imagine where, if that's the lens that a lot of the language we have has been written from, absolutely I can see why it would be seen as pathological demand avoidance. But it's like, actually, when you appreciate a lot of the historical context and the ongoing, challenges, oppression, systemic racism still has not been resolved, it's like this actually could be framed as quite a natural and understandable and arguably adaptive response for people to have in these contexts. And so it's always really fascinating when you look at it from that sort of critical social perspective as well, because there's just so many layers in unpacking what,
isn't there?
Even talking about LGBTQI communities, like, homosexuality was still in the DSM until like the 90s. So it's like, because it was seen as abnormal. So we can't escape these things when we're looking at how we diagnose and define conditions. I guess you touched on before some of the barriers that people might experience when trying to navigate diagnosis. I'm interested in, from maybe your own experiences, but also from your research as well, if there are any other particular barriers or challenges to diagnosis that people seem to be coming up against, and even when it comes to ways we might be able to advocate or things that might need to change, are there any really jump out at you from the work you've been doing?
Yeah, and so I started interviewing women and gender diverse people. I have realised that I need to, because I think gender still might be the thing I focus on, but including men. And because I realised that, yes, we say that most of the research has been done around boys and men in terms of neurodivergence, but not probably by neurodivergent boys and men. And so that's why I realized, okay, no, we really need. And so the difference is huge, right? Because it's just actually such a small subset. It's like actually a real minority of people who are actually doing any of this research around any of these areas. Actually, it's actually, I don't know what that might be, but I'm visualizing, a 5% by the time you add up all the layers of privilege. And so, so again, like, and which I think is great, because, women are quite good at connecting and things to start that conversation. And it's definitely need to have that led by men or bring men in on that conversation. I've done a very ADHD thing. Oh yes, diagnosis. And so, some of the things that came up was around masking again, because this is how I bring it to gender, because women mask so well, but I also acknowledge that isn't just about women, but it's a helpful starting point, who are socialized to mask well. Like, it's not acceptable to just let yourself flop out of the container in a way. Like, it's really important to keep that mask on. And again, I acknowledge that that's just probably so many men, that is not the case. And I think about, Aboriginal men as a starting point, there's so many more dangers than there would be for me to, just allowing yourself there's so many more fears that could come up is what I mean to say. So I acknowledge that. But for women, and the women I interviewed and gender diverse people I interviewed, often was to do with the success of their mask. So you'd have literally psychologists who would say things like, how many scratches have you got on your car? And I think one said, maybe 5 or 6 minor scratches. And they said, nah, you haven't got ADHD. Like, you would have big accidents if that was the case. Also someone else got dismissed because they were on time to the appointment. And so no idea about this duck waddling stuff that goes on under the surface. Like, you guys will know like what it takes for me. I don't know if you're the same. My partner would want to go to the airport an hour before. I want to be there 6 hours before, because there's so much space for things to go wrong. But that's what I'll do. So I don't maybe look ADHD because I'm on time for that flight. But yeah, the stuff that went on before it, and I was I packed probably last minute, because, I needed the kind of cortisol to be pumping in order to actually get organized. But then I'm up 2 hours later, way earlier than I need to be, to make sure that I get on time for all the things I might have missed and forgotten. And then I get there, cheery face, looking fine, but then you crash, don't you? That's that burnout. And then there's a series of burnouts again and again. We know what that can lead to. So it was really simple things that were in the way. It was just these assumptions about, or actually it was a lack of curiosity, that Walt Whitman thing about people were judgmental, not curious. And I think that is isn't that the biggest lesson for health professionals, to just keep asking questions and educate yourself so you can be aware of things that might stick out for certain groups, sure, but really just to, ask what it took to come here today, or even acknowledge it must have taken you a lot to want to come here today. Like, acknowledge the cost for a person. Like, this is not a walk in the park to go and, I'm going to go and get an ADHD diagnosis tomorrow. Like, it just shows how how removed from society so many people are who are in these professions. Like, we need a privilege check in their health professions,
Agreed. Big time. It's even just thinking about experiences of friends. The one in particular I had coffee with over the weekend that shared a diagnosis journey as like a privileged white woman in a metropolitan context, and just how challenging it was there, and how much outdated practice perhaps, and assumed kind of, I'm getting my wording wrong here. This is where my brain catches up with itself and loses track. The gaslighting continuing, and it gets really frustrating. And that curiosity that you mentioned is really, if you can simplify it back to one thing, it's definitely where I keep landing. So it's reassuring to say that. And to make the worst segue of all time, the curiosity that you've clearly carried throughout your research, because there's so many different topics. I am fascinated by what you've picked up in your understanding of how these different people from different cultural backgrounds that are neurodiverse found coping. Like, even to say coping mechanisms is annoying. Coping mechanisms or lifestyles, behaviors, activities. Annoying. Yeah, you know what I mean.
It's actually a fantastic segue, Ollie. And it's a really good question to actually ask about the self-care and the coping strategies specifically for different groups. I don't know all the answers to that, but there were a few that stood out. So there was one woman, for example, who talked about PDA. They were the one who brought that up, and said that, connected it to eye contact, and said, the only two beings on this planet I can look at in the eye is occasionally my child, who also doesn't like making eye contact. They're autistic and ADHD. But my dog, like, I can stare my dog in the eyes forever, because the dog is not demanding anything of me. I feel safe, 100% safe. There's not going to be a request for anything. So I found that really interesting. And that was, a Black person who, just talked about how they were born with that kind of deficit of already being taken from, like, actually needed more put into them. But one of the ways that person, for example, also acknowledged and recognized that they also needed to sort of fill up with goodness. And a lot of that was through spiritual practices. So actually connecting with spirit, with something bigger. I won't use all the language, but a lot of, and I, partly as a researcher, I'm curious to that anyway. So I'm a yoga teacher, mindfulness teacher, a Reiki master. So I'm already sort of tuned into that, which is another bias for a lot of researchers that may think in a really linear way, even if they're neurodivergent, maybe forced into thinking that way because they've got to talk that way. So I was really keen to be allowed to open spaces where people could talk about God, religion, in terms of Christianity and Catholicism came up for some people, other people more in the language of ancestors and spirit. So that came up quite a bit. And that was that kind of unconditional space where There wasn't need for defending yourself or masking yourself. And so that was really interesting. And that's something that I would be interested in doing more research in that area. And I think that's, again, portal to everything. That's true in any area of research, that we don't allow space for those discussions. And maybe that makes sense because it's not, academia is very much a space where you're writing and wording things. And to a degree, that's perhaps a space that doesn't have language. But I think language is important as a starting and an entry point for people. So that was another one. And then nature, again, which is a connection to spirit, this kind of idea of spirituality too. And for others, not at all. Other people didn't make that connection at all. And just, but again, it was an unconditional space where you could be accepted in nature and replenish without having to sort of give something back or demands being met in return. And you could just be yourself. So it was really interesting. I when I went in, I thought there was going to be more discussion around certain herbs that people took or alternatives to medication. A lot of people talk about medication, how helpful that was, but nobody saw that as a panacea. Like it was always something that needed to be complemented by something else. It might help them get through the working week, but they didn't necessarily want to take on the weekend because they didn't feel like so much themselves, for example. That'd be very common. And then sort of, I know it sounds cliche, but a lot of healthy lifestyle choices were also it. But one of the big ones, and this is true for people of all backgrounds, was making choices around work, not trying to fight the system, actually leaving the workplace. Now that does relate, of course, then to who has the privilege to do that and make those choices. People spoke about changing their working week. A lot of people really struggled financially, but it was still beneficial to work, say, 3 days a week or 4 days a week because they were acknowledged. And again, like the diagnosis maybe gave them permission to say, well, this is what's happening. This is the cycle. It's burnout. It's leading to sickness. This is actually in the long run justified because, I'll live longer and let people down. Less people would often worry about letting people down with that kind of stuff. So that was a big one. It wasn't, taking certain kind of drug or some special medication they found. I've got to acknowledge that was still a big part of it.
Yeah.
But there were and then stuff that just connected them with who they were, like music, drumming. Drumming came up again and again, which I find really interesting. There's lots of stuff to do with rhythm and certain beats. And I find I followed, this is like very embryonic for me. I've listened to lots of stuff that links intuition with neurodivergence. And as someone who is, I've got a lot of intuitive practices myself, but I haven't actually followed that in line of inquiry in an academic sense yet, like what that connection is. But it's a really interesting one. And people had practices that sort of emulated that, connecting to something a bit deeper. And sometimes that was just wanting deeper meaning.
Yeah.
Being in jobs that they loved. And it's the greatest curse in a way with someone with ADHD, like needing to follow your passions. It can be a real curse if you just can't find an entry point to that. But once you find it, it's just brilliant. Yeah.
It's wonderful. So I'm hearing like underlying themes of really, whether it's a yoga practice, whether it's a community, whether it's a set of beliefs and the interaction of all of them or context, all of them come back to something that reinforces safety and autonomy, it seems, for those people, for us. Because yoga's done that for me big time.
Yeah.
For
that's interesting. But is that from a safety perspective? Like what would you link that to?
Yeah, because I think about this is something that if the cards of fate play well, I hope to research soon, bringing these practices into healthcare in whatever way is possible. I think about what is it behind these practices that help people so that I can see beyond the arbitrary distinctions of certain styles of practice or forms or, things that we get stuck in trapped around. Like I can't stand on my head in yoga, therefore I can't do yoga. And it's like, no. And I think because I've had such luck to have good teachers, it seems to come back to that sense of anything that creatively allows that person to come back to a state of non-doing. Or I think what's trendy now is, deep rest as a phrasing of it. But there's probably many ways of phrasing it. But that sense of, can I be in this moment without a need to get anywhere or do anything, and provide a allowed, accessed, supported to do that?
Yep.
Yeah.
And that space it's not only no longer burning that energy unnecessarily of thoughts, worrying, future, past, all that stuff. You're actually replenishing in that space of presence. Yes. And that's a really difficult place to find in other ways, isn't it?
Completely agree. Yeah.
Outside of presence. It's really interesting.
It's so interesting and like hearing about this. So, I mean, I guess probably clinically we see these overlaps all the time. And I think, unfortunately, the research just isn't there yet around unpacking some of these intersections between ADHD and autism, chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia. I recently did a talk at the Australian Pain Society conference on neurodivergence and pain, and I guess some of the neurobiological underpinnings of that. And the really frustrating thing was we kind of have these discrete pockets of research that might sort of suggest that there is a link between them in the sense that there are overlapping mechanisms, but everything has been looked at in such a siloed, segmented way.
Exactly.
And like a lot of the research we have, say, looking at, for example, there are a few papers quite a few papers actually that show autistic people have higher levels of neuroinflammation generally and systemic inflammation. And it's like, that's great. However, because we haven't had the sort of most holistic lens to research in the past, we also have a lot of the research we have has been done predominantly on young boys, which is part of the problem. We also haven't accounted for a lot of the conditions we now know overlap quite a lot with autism. So we don't know of these people that are in these studies, say how many of them also had a co-occurring hypermobility disorder. We don't know how many of them had co-occurring dysautonomia. We don't know how many of them have experienced trauma, because all of these things have very similar presentations. And it's also really interesting then when we're looking at these intersections between ADHD and autism and then pain and fatigue, because the neurobiology and the changes that happen as a response to trauma, we do know there's quite strong literature now linking that to pain and fatigue outcomes, particularly, looking at early childhood events and later in life. There is quite a well-documented link, and we know that it really worsens pain outcomes. But I find that interesting then when we're looking in the neurodiversity space and we're looking at autism particularly. And I saw a really interesting, there's this sort of growing take, I guess, where we're talking about autism and the fact that because we live in such a violently neurotypical world a lot of the time, that we don't actually really have a good idea of what untraumatized ADHD or untraumatized autism looks like, because people have gone their whole life trying to adapt and they've had all of these cumulative experiences that when we look at then how that presents and the impacts it has, it's like, well, is it inherently autism and ADHD that has these links to pain and fatigue, or is it sort of the mediating factor, the fact that people are then having to mask, adapt and go through life in these more challenging spaces that aren't really to them? And I don't think we have the answer to that, but it was just really interesting trying to unpack all that research.
The paradigms, the assumptions.
Yeah, wow.
No, you're absolutely right, Sophie. And I think as well, not just neurodivergent people, but I do feel like it's been my experience so far, but there's a real openness, and I don't know. I think partly it's the hyperfocus. I know a lot of people who are really interested in people, firstly, like that's a hyperfocus and how they work. And then are really interested in neurodivergence because they are neurodivergent. So perhaps being interested in personal experience. And somehow that kind of transcends barriers a little bit, that people are quite keen to work together. And actually, yeah, I'm leading a group of neurodivergent women and non-binary people, all from very different backgrounds, different universities. And it's really interesting because, again, like I'm learning language for things that I don't quite have the concept until someone's given me a word, and we're all sharing words with each other. It's just making this much bigger picture that is a container for our experience that actually allows you to be more in a way.
Right.
So I think that's right. I think that's what we need more of. So if you're totally right about that. To see it from more angles and then check our underlying assumptions. And because I think it's really good when someone else points out your assumptions through their difference as well. Yeah. And that's a really helpful process. One thing, back to Ollie's question about what you made me think of it. So it was about what are different groups of people doing as well. I noticed a lot of people, again, this is only qualitative research. That means we're doing interviews, not big surveys. So I will look into this future. But a lot of women talked about internal family systems. But I'm really interested in that. And actually quite a few people said not CBT. CBT actually was difficult for me, but that makes sense to me in the context of PDA. It's like you're also demanding someone tells that person they're wrong in your mind to shut it up. It's like being told to shut up again. And you've done that to yourself so many times, haven't you? You've done so. It's just like, I don't need that. And there's parts of you. So this internal family systems is about parts, and you've got a self underneath all of it. And that part is, that's always a calm place. And that's a centered, you've got clarity, you've got courage, all these kind of feelings that make you feel sort of safe in the world. But the parts are noisy. And someone with ADHD, there's some theory that actually has just a lot more parts going on that are triggered by various things in order to cope with things in society. They've developed these, complex parts basically. But it's a really interesting thing because the work is to listen to the parts. To people in mindfulness, and I teach mindfulness very differently to how I used to, consequently, sort of told to just ignore the thoughts. And that's true to an extent in this parts work, but there's a point where you need to listen to the voice and to hear what's underneath the voice. Like, why are you telling me that's bad, or I'm no good, or I'm lazy? Like, what are you protecting from me underneath? And that's where sometimes it comes back to trauma, and it comes back to, or being told to be differently in the world to how you are, and how there's might be all these layers, even if ADHD might still be the root for everyone, just all these complicated parts that are developed around masking. Yeah, and it just is a portal, this IFS, to actually being able to listen to your internal landscape rather than deny it.
It's so interesting because I think that's a theme we even see clinically when I'm working with people who have pain and fatigue conditions, is that so often people have had to kind of go into almost this survival mode and just basically shut down. It's like, I can't listen to what's going on in my body because it is screaming at I can't, their body actually becomes a not safe place to be. And that's
Yes.
really, I mean, it's a really profound thing to really think about because we're so used to being, our body is us, like it's so closely entwined. But for a lot of people, that isn't a safe space to be. And I think a thing that Ollie and I, Ollie, OC, have spoken about a lot in the past is that, often from a pain management perspective, for example, there's a tendency for us to just throw out these like ideas of like, oh, well, someone has chronic pain because pain is biopsychosocial and it can be affected by stress. We've got to get people doing mindfulness and like relaxation techniques, being straight into things like deep breathing, for example, or like scans. And I've worked with a lot of people for whom that's actually incredibly triggering for them because they are so not comfortable being in their body, but that's not something we're necessarily taught as health professionals. It's seen as a very safe, like low risk thing to just get people doing deep breathing.
Not trauma-informed at all.
Yeah.
I think even though maybe they understand it, there's a misunderstanding that lots of memories are caught up in your head. They're in your body. So short-term memory, yes, we've got some in the brain, but long-term memory, where does that go? And actually that's a visceral experience. Like you could be doing a body scan, and without that understanding and that trauma-informed approach and that individual-centered care as well, because it is really different for everyone. Yeah, you cannot just think that you can have the same protocol for each person. You have to be curious. And I've noticed that because I taught for years people with chronic fatigue syndrome, and I still do, but I had a business just for people with chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, and other chronic conditions, yoga. And it was just so different for each person. I prefer doing one-on-one, but when I had to teach a class, I had to try and make space to make sure people could choose things. And often you needed to do something quite physical first to sort of let the energy out a little bit of the body. And before asking someone to sit, especially someone with ADHD, I was going to just sit. And like, I remember I never thought I'd be a yoga teacher. Oh my God, if you'd have told me that when I was younger. I remember sitting, it was at first at university, and someone turned the lights out. We had to lie in Shavasana, in that lying down pose for like 20 minutes, and it was cold. And I have a history of trauma, and I got into my head that maybe she was going to walk around with a dagger or something, and I couldn't see it. And my body was absolutely making this scenario up that was so, to someone else, they would laugh at it, but it was so real for me. And I felt so, and also coupled with this thing of be a good girl, do not move, do not disrupt the class. Those two things, like my fear and the expectation going together, like I thought I was going to die in that moment. And that sounds hilarious and dramatic, but I know you guys will understand.
Totally.
It really, yeah, it's in the body.
And this is the thing that Soph and I talk about a lot, and what I hope comes out, well, I see it more and more in the research, is that the biopsychosocial thing isn't three separate buckets, but it's a multi-layered onion. It almost stretches out into societal spiritual, which is what we're hearing from your findings and your work so far, that it's all connected in a biological way. I think we'll find the ways that they're interconnected. And how, if you can't be safe at the, political, social level, then it has biological consequences, or vice versa. And it's really validating to hear you share these stories. Thank you.
Oh, that's lovely, Ollie. And I think you're right that there's all a multi-layered onion. But if we all work together, I think you can have, three separate languages from people in different areas, three different experts, for example. And that's a healthy, good thing if we're all informing what our understanding of that onion is, or helping each other. And I think that's really helpful. Like, people need different entry points.
There's an ecology metaphor that seems to be running through our discussion today. Through neurodivergence, we can understand the ecology of how we all have, that really valued but different perspective, and how through interacting and teaming up like you have, which is also really inspiring, I think, academically. Like I'm seeing the projects, the people that go far are the ones that go together, to
true, isn't
then
it?
share those perspectives and transform people's lives and suffering for the better.
Yeah, and I think I've got an emerging theory about that, which you guys might have better language for, but just around actually the usefulness of diagnosis at this point in time.
Yes.
It's kind of the problem with people with ADHD often is that they've got this brilliance that doesn't know where to go anywhere, but that's actually the lack of community. And so that's actually that's a societal problem that everyone is suffering from, but we've sort of set it up in this way to suit a certain number of people. But actually, everyone would do so much better. And I know it can be quite cheesy, especially in the time of Trump, where everything is trying to stop discussions of diversity. It's really important to explain not just how it's like trying to give everyone a fair go. It's much deeper than that. It's like how to make the society is coming to a bit of a crunch, because we're not working together. And so that's so I've got this project, ADHD Healing Project and podcast. But the idea is that, and I'm not sure how it's going to happen, I'm hoping lots of people are going to come in organically and help each other, is that we come together with each person's brilliance to kind of make some great projects. Like you might have a great poet, you might have someone who's really good on the internet. Listen to me, that shows how I'm the one who's good at technology. He's good at the internet. But yeah, so people with these different components who come together to make this beautiful documentary on something, ADHD and poetry or something, or I don't know, but you just got a lot of brilliant people. And because they're trying to do it all alone, that's why they're collapsing.
Yeah.
Rather than just being allowed to have their hyper focus, and then you have lots of other hyper focuses coming together, as opposed to the few that thrive. Because I think there might be a lot of white, that cliche, a guy, and there must be a lot of poor white men. I do feel like we also give them a hard time quite often, but who were able to have their brilliance, but then, have a admin assistant and have a mother who did this and a wife who does the washing. And so they've actually got that community already, but those people around them aren't being acknowledged. So what I envisage is a community where we're all doing those things, but everyone is acknowledged for their brilliance at those different aspects,
Well, that's it. Back in the day, we'd never had to do everything. It was, we lived in a community, we lived in a village, and you might have one person who was, really good at going to, I was about to say hunt berries, scavenge berries, you know what I mean? Go berry picking. You had one who might go hunt. You had others who were staying home and, raising kids, and others who would cook. And it was a totally different beast to what it is now, where we're all so hyper individualist now, and that's how we've been conditioned to be. And in many ways, I think it's antithetical to the way that we've evolved and what we naturally want to gravitate to, but it's partly those areas that are set up that, particularly amidst capitalism and the sort of push to be productive, and really there's so many different layers to unpack in that. I guess bringing it back to the fatigue and the pain side of things, we've spoken a bit about some of the strategies that people might be using, I guess, to sort of help thrive amidst ADHD, autism, just from your research. I'm interested if, from the work you've been doing and from your experiences, if we were thinking maybe as clinicians who are working with people who have pain and fatigue, who might also be ADHD or autistic, would there be any recommendations or considerations that you would have for maybe the ways in which we might as clinicians need to or could adapt or tailor some of the sort of pain and fatigue management strategies to better suit neurodivergent people?
I always think, I don't know the full answer to that, and obviously your context is a bit different to mine, but I always think, again, it's important for everybody, but I think for a lot of neurodivergent people who I speak to, explaining the why of what you're doing is really important. And again, I think with anyone with any trauma, that's also true. So I think probably you should do that for everyone. But there will be that small subset of society that knows that someone like you is going to look after them because that's what they're used to. But most people actually, but neurodivergent people especially, that connection to the why you're doing will just help so much with adherence and allowing space to say, well, that's not going to suit me. And then just checking that whatever you're suggesting, especially if you're suggesting to do something outside of the room, to something back at home, is to check in how realistic that is. So I don't know if you guys like this. Some neurodivergent people say that just goes in one ear, and they just know they can't do that. They'd love to, and they've gone through that cycle of saying, I'm going to set myself 6 reminders. And then again, this is difficult when you are a neurodivergent practitioner as well as with neurodivergent people, is to make sure you've got really clear processes to help that person. Don't say refer them to someone else and just get them to look it up. it is like possibly, and this isn't the case for all neurodivergent people, but it can really help to send a link or to perhaps do it there and then, get them to link up with this person there and then in your appointment, just small things like that. You guys will know as neurodivergent people, it makes a huge difference if you've just done it and you don't have homework to do after the appointment. Because you also will put the appointment off if you haven't done your homework too, right?
Everyone does. Yes.
Like
yeah.
I can't go back until I've actually done this. And that's the thing, I think, from my experience, people will often know as soon as you tell them something that actually, like, I know that this is not going to be realistic, I'm not going to do it, but also I'm not going to say anything. And so I think what you mentioned before, everyone's needs are different. So how can we actually tailor and actually work with the person to make strategies work, I think has been probably the most helpful thing I've found in my own practice, is just everyone's different. Everyone's brain works and interacts differently with the world. And it's kind of working with them to work out the most efficient and effective way to put some of this stuff in practice by asking them, I think has probably been clinically the most helpful thing I've found. Ollie, what about you? Is there anything that jumps out at you that we haven't mentioned that you found helpful?
I just really, everything you just said has summarized probably the last 12 months of what I've been reflecting on a lot around giving, I guess, just really understanding what people's capacity is and what's the point of it. Like that, the why first, as you said, to really explain it. That was something I remember actually a therapist, a neurodivergent therapist, the first ever therapist that was really helpful for me. It was because they were able to explain the why and seeing that I needed that. And it's something that I didn't realize I've been doing in my practice quite early on, I think, thankfully, one of the good habits I've had. But then recently letting go of the habits of imposing these behavioral changes and expecting them too quick, and actually realizing that, like, I can come up with the best exercise ever, let's say, even if that was true. If you're not inspired or, interested in doing it, then no one's going to do it. And so what's far more interesting to me clinically, and this, as you said, this is probably for any human, is what actually excites you, and how can I be of service to draw out what excites you into a therapeutic process to then make it achieve the goal for you seeing me in the first place. Like, wouldn't that be more fun for everyone? It's something I'm seeing a lot, and Soph and I've seen in even some research projects recently. So to hear you say that's a very astute reminder.
Yeah, those are beautiful points. And just moving on from what you're saying, Ollie, about creating spaces that people feel safe and motivated in. I've got an HDR student who's looking at physiotherapy practice and how to incorporate use of essential oils in that practice. And there's lots of research about the calming nature and the kind of SIM effect, the safety and me signals that can be given off with that. Again, it's going to depend on each person. You might, if you go and suddenly start putting lavender in your room, and some people are going to have a really visceral response to that, it's got to be patient-centered. But I think more of those supplementary kind of research, that kind of thing, needs to be done. And but it can be a survey in your own practice. It can be a protocol of asking each individual people things they like in their environment. Some people do like certain kinds of music, for example. It's just things that people don't think about. It's like, no, this is physiotherapy. This is how we do it. It's a professional practice. But I think we need to make that stuff professional. We need to make it mainstream to foster safety.
This has been really fantastic, and I am really grateful for you coming and sharing some of your insights from your research and also from your lived experience. I guess to finish us off, looking ahead, what questions do you have that might sort of come through in terms of future research or things you're interested in exploring more in the future? What's next for you?
Well, I've touched on a few of them, and one being broadening that discussion. And so storytelling is a big one. So I've got the ADHD Community Healing Project where I've got a podcast, but it's bigger than that. Yeah, I don't know what it's going to be, but a space for creativity where people come together. So that's one avenue, but also opening that conversation. That's where I was going with that. I realized, because I've been interviewing just women and gender diverse people, I've just started interviewing fellas. And I think that's really broadening and enriching the discussion. So I'm really excited about that. And my research will still talk about gender, but it will be all genders. And it's so funny that it's ironic that we kind of don't do that. We so much has been centered around men originally. And then so now we're centering things around women often. And the inability to bring it all together is kind of mind blowing, isn't it, from an intersectional perspective?
Yeah.
But also, so I mentioned the HDR student and oils. So I've got quite a few HDR students who are going off in really interesting areas, some about workplace learning and how to support neurodivergent people in the workplace, around that crossover between neurodivergence and being LGBTQI+. I think that's a really interesting area to explore. Like, why do they come together so often? And what's the experience of that crossover? And also doing some larger surveys, larger international surveys, one on sport, not just sport, physical activity, I should say, because I think sport conjures up trauma for so many people, and some people have a really great idea of what that is, but just that, more like barriers to that physical experience of physical activity. And there's so many assumptions around, people say do more exercise. It's like the complex layers around that are just infinite. So look into that, and just more about these coping strategies and not alternatives to medication. I was really, really clear about that, but some complementary processes around being well with neurodivergence.
If people are interested in following along and seeing what you're up to over the next little while, is there anywhere in particular that would be best for them to scope you out in future?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm always in a pickle with trying to set up websites. Probably clean. But yeah, you can find me through Charles Sturt, Dr. Oli Meredith, and I often get a lot of emails, and I'll always reply to let you know what's going on. And there is, if you look up ADHD Healing Community Project, I am just making a website for that, but there is a Facebook page for that currently. You can show your interest. I've got a mailing subscription list too, where I'm just sharing projects as we go about that. That's probably the best stuff.
Just to thank you so much for joining us today and sharing all of your wisdom. I'm the richer for it, and I can't wait to hear more of your work coming out and to listen into that podcast. It's certainly been great so far.
Thanks so much, guys. It's been really lovely to talk to you both.
Thank you so much. Until next time.
Bye.